Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here today with Ross Douthat. I'm here to talk about his new book, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Is that the right subtitle?
Everyone, Richard.
Everyone.
I was going to call it why, sort of aggressive Nietzschean, and I don't know. I tell people, I have specific subtitles for every potential reader. And yours would have been, long and complex.
Yes, and I do mean everyone. Yes, exclamation.
That's right. I do even you. Yes.
Excellent. And I enjoyed the book, Ross. I wouldn't. I think it's, I don't read many books on theology. I can't remember the last book I read on religious questions. That wasn't just like a historical book, but because I was familiar with your work from on political and cultural issues, I thought I'd give it a try. And I found it interesting. It spoke to me a little bit. I mean, there's some there that's kind of convincing, thought provoking. Some stuff that's less so, and glad to kind of get into it. First of all,
the Holy Spirit moves gradually in the human. So
yes.
what you're feeling are the first stirrings of an eventual total transformation.
Yeah. Okay. So like the book, the theory of the book is you're trying. It feels like it feels like you want people. It kind of feels like the idea that there's something out there as kind of a gateway drug. Like I think you tell people whatever feels best for you. There's this kind of this idea that, okay, if Mormonism or Buddhism is speaking to you, go with that. That's better than not being religious, right? But I think your hope is that the truth will eventually lead people to Christianity and ultimately Catholicism. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the book is sort of somewhat transparent about simultaneously trying to be extremely open-minded about the diversity of religions and trying to give people who do not have some sort of very particular sense of, where they should be, which religion is likely to be truest, sort of, suggestions on how to think about the dilemmas, where to start, and so on. And then at the end, the last chapter is about how I think my own Christian beliefs make sense in light of the structure and the argument that I've set up. And so, clearly there's sort of an apologetic pro-Christian angle to the book. But it is, I am being sincere in the argument that I do think generally, not in every case, but generally, it is a better idea to commit to a religious tradition if one seems sort of there and appropriate for you, rather than sort of remaining forever, however long your life may be, in a kind of, uncertain agnosticism, waiting to feel like you have 100% certainty about the truest faith of all.
Is it simply that there's a practical case for this, that you will just be kind of better off? Or is it also, do you think that God in the end sort of takes account whether you were, whether you were religious? Like, I feel like because it's sort of, there's this trichotomy where it's like Catholicism, Christianity's true. There's people who are closer to like reality because they have some religious faith that has some basis in tradition and some connection to something divine. And then you have like us godless heathens over here who are sort of kind of lost. And I guess people on this spectrum, they're better off in this life the more they get towards that pole where you're at. Is it also that there's a kind of reward at the end for people who are saying category 2 instead of category 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of general utilitarian case for religious practice and belief that everybody who argues on the internet is familiar with. I'm trying not very explicitly not to make any kind of pure sort of worldly utilitarian argument to say, well, you got to join up because of the social benefits and because it will reduce political polarization, and everyone should go to church the same way they join a bowling league and these kind of things. I think there's truth to those arguments, but I think for very good reasons they have a kind of limited appeal in the end. And if you're actually trying to persuade people to be religious in an authentic way, you need to persuade them that a religious picture of reality is broadly true. But then within those pictures of reality, I think one of my basic assumptions in the book is the idea that, if there is a God, right, if there is some higher power that created the universe with you and I in mind, then he is probably not just trying to trick you, right?
Mm.
That like he's not just out to get you by, hiding the true faith in some place where you can't possibly find it, and then, cackling away as you disappear into hell. Now, obviously, there are schools of religious thought that would be a caricature of them, but sort of do take some version of that perspective, and like, the sort of hard predestinarian forms of Christianity do sort of veer towards. They wouldn't say God is out to get you, but the outsider looking at certain forms of Calvinism would certainly say, kind of seems like God might be out to get you. But I don't, I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's the right way to approach religion. And if you assume that God isn't out to get you, then you do have to have some confidence, I think, that acting sincerely and authentically in a way that puts you on the road to looking for God will elicit some sort of response and some sort of guidance. And I think it's clear enough from looking around the world that not everybody is going to end up in the same place. Um, there's a religious marketplace and religious competition, and in that environment, it's very unlikely that every single person who sets out on a religious journey is going to end up in the same place. Um, yeah, but I do think that if you assume a a God who has some version of our good in mind, then you should also assume that setting out on the journey, even if you don't get all the way, is a good thing to do and will have
Mm.
benefits in this life. And then also, obviously, more importantly, in whatever awaits us after this particular experience is over.
Hmm. Do you think in
Or
terms of
after we've taken the, Canadian euthanasia. There's after we've made our exit in whatever form.
right? Are you so? Do you think in terms of probabilities? Do you ever put a number on the supernatural being real, Christianity being real, Catholicism being real? Do you have numbers in mind?
I did this. I don't think that's a great exercise. I did a version of this for Tyler Cowen once upon a time,
Mm.
that your listeners and watchers can look up. I think the title of the post, it was back when I sort of had a blog for the Times, and it was something like, "Should Tyler Cowen believe in God?"
Mm.
And I tried to do a set of probabilities. I don't remember what they are, and I'm not going to like try and pluck them again. I
Uh,
do assign I would say what is definitely the case is I assign a very low probability to eliminative materialism, sort of hard materialism being true. A very, very low probability. I think once you get beyond that into realms where you're considering um various ways that sort of mind and being and consciousness can exist prior to and separate from matter, then, you know, then you're not going to be able to say, absent a sort of personal revelation, oh, I have, 97% certainty that this particular view is true. But I would wager a lot. I guess I've wagered my life in some
right.
ways on the
Yeah.
idea that the materialists are wrong.
Yeah. So the yeah. So the yeah. I mean, I think the consciousness, the mystery of consciousness, is to me what gets me. I cannot even like the hard problem of consciousness. Just I don't know what to do with it. Like I don't know. Like I don't have an explanation. I don't know like what an explanation would look like. Maybe we say God did it. Maybe there's the supernatural. The consciousness exists independently of matter. I don't know. It's like really hard. And this is the kind of uh, the opening of the door in my kind of worldview. It's like I just have no idea and no explanation makes sense. And when you talk about this in the book, when people talk about it's it's an illusion, it's not real, this and that, it just strikes me as self evidently absurd. So yeah, I'm open to there's something being out there. Um,
Yeah,
the
well, let's pick that up and work with it for a second, right? Because I think what you're responding to, right, is the fact that in our experience of existence, right, mind consciousness appears to be a primary form of reality, right? It's like the form of reality that we experience more directly than I experience even like flicking my laptop case or banging my, foot against a closet door or
mm,
something, right? And a lot of materialist thought is built up on the assumption that like this is just this experience is just a mistake. The experience of it as primary, right? Not that, not that consciousness doesn't have some kind of reality, but the idea that it is in any way prior to um, the material is just a mistake, and in some way consciousness has to be downstream from materiality.
Mhm.
And I just think we have more reasons to suspect that isn't true now than we did even in the fairly recent past. And some of it is, just the articulation by non-religious philosophers of what you just mentioned, like the idea that consciousness is a hard problem that is extremely difficult to solve in materialist terms. There are other things, and I sort of gesture at them in the book. They obviously go into sort of deeper scientific territory that I'm not fully competent to elaborate. But I think what you see just in the strangeness at the bottom of quantum physics, for instance, where mind observation, like the act of sort of conscious intervention in some form into material reality, seems to actually collapse, possibility into reality, is also a pretty strong, and again, from a point of view of materialism, surprising indicator that um, that mind has some kind of, if not priority, at least independence from matter. And I don't think that gets you, certainly doesn't get you all the way to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it takes you somewhere,
Mhm.
I think, that then should shape how you read other forms of evidence, whether it's, the sort of basic design and order of the cosmos, supernatural experience, these kind of things. I think you can read other aspects of the religious case that you may find less persuasive in light of that primary experience, and, you know, tiptoe a step closer.
Yeah, it feels like, I mean, when you do believe, well, let's actually get into like sort of the theological specifics here. So
Sure.
the standard Catholic view is you are Catholic, you go to heaven if you accept Christ through the church. If not, you go to hell, or you go through. What's the role of purgatory? What's like the standard? Like if you went to the Pope, what would he tell you?
So the official what am I saying? The official view would be that if you die in a state of grace, meaning that effectively you are sorry for whatever sins you have committed and are in some kind of right relationship with God,
Mm.
then you are guaranteed to eventually go to heaven. And
Okay.
that purgatory exists for, in effect, the purgation and transformation of the seriously sinful soul, right? So it's like, you can, in fact, sin for your entire life,
Sure.
right? And have a sincere conversion on your deathbed. It does have to be, in fact, sincere, right? You can't just game the system, and in fact you won't be able to. I think the Catholic view is basically that, like, your habits and behavior turn you into a specific kind of person, right? And
Mm.
that kind of person is not just, automatically going to be able to pivot when the crucial moment arrives. Um, but yeah, you can, if you are sincere and turn to God at any point in your life and remain with that turning. Um, the sins you have committed determine, certain things that you have to go through after death in order to attain the beatific vision.
Mm.
But um, but that's sort of that. But you are that's a category of people whose salvation is assured, right?
Okay.
Um, and then there was a long-standing Catholic debate about, for instance, unbaptized infants who do not, have not received the grace of baptism, don't seem capable exactly of, sort of regret for sin, are in the original sin that Jesus came to save us from. They die. What happens to them, right? And you had, Saint Augustine very famously and sternly insisted that they went to hell, and then the church developed a concept of limbo,
Mm.
of a kind of beatific state short of full beatitude. And then sort of played around with it, and I think semi-officially discarded it, although in terms of what the church dogmatically teaches, there's always a little bit of uncertainty. But that's sort of the pattern, right? It's heaven, purgatory, some uncertainty around limbo, and then for people who die fully in their sins, damnation. But then there's sort of further debates beyond that, right? Where it's like, well, what does it mean to sort of, to die in your sins if, let's say, you have never had anything happen in your life that would give you reason to be a Catholic, right? To sort of become Christian. You've never had an encounter with, any encounter at all with Jesus, or you've had an encounter, but it was it was the worst priest in history, and you certainly couldn't be blamed for not becoming Catholic, right? So then there's this sort of uncertain category that in the old days the church would have called invincible ignorance. That's not the term people use as much anymore, but trads on the internet would certainly use it. That is the kind of like general category for the person who the church would deem virtuous in some ways, who has not made a confession of faith, has not said explicitly, I'm sorry for my sins, but the church would say, well, we're uncertain. They're in the hands of God. And from my own perspective, I think the category of purgatory seems usefully flexible. This is, a somewhat heterodox opinion, but usefully flexible in terms of thinking about what it would mean to have a large number of people who are not sort of, checking all the formal boxes of Catholic doctrine about salvation, but do seem, just in like the language of the New Testament, right? Like if you sit and read the Gospels, Jesus very explicitly talks about people who are being welcomed into heaven because they cared for the poor and the sick and the needy without sort of explicitly doing it in his own name, right? There's a very famous passage where it's like, everyone shows up on Judgment Day and the sheep say, oh, when did we serve you, Lord? And he said, well, you served me when you served others, and so on, right? And again, I think passages like that create a certain kind of space for imagining that, to go back to my earlier point, that virtue in non-Christian religions also can have an eternal reward.
Okay, so you have the people who are Catholics, good people, they die, they're in good relationship with God, they go to heaven. There's some people who are kind of, in between limbo or purgatory, and then there's some portion of humanity that is just eternal damnation. Is that right?
That is Catholic doctrine, yes. There are, then, I mean, the 20th century, late 20th century, everyone became liberal, right, in various ways. And so then there's sort of a sub-school of Catholic thought that actually, I say liberal, but it includes theologians who were, for instance, friendly with Pope John Paul II, who would be considered conservatives in certain ways, who, sort of took a kind of quasi-universalist view and said, it's not that we can assume that everyone goes to heaven, but we should hope for it, right? It should be something we pray for. It should be a possibility that we consider. So there's that school as well. You can't be an Orthodox Catholic theologian. That's as sort of far as you can go, I think, as an Orthodox Catholic towards universalism. You can't go all the way to David Bentley Hart, the prolific Eastern Orthodox theologian who's made he's made a career in many different ways and many different brilliant ways. But one of his particular arguments within the Christian context is no, all Christians should be universalist, and the consensus of the Catholic Church and most Protestant denominations, what he calls infernalism, the belief in an eternal hell, is in fact contrary to the Gospels. I think that's wrong. I'm not completely qualified to debate translations of Greek and Aramaic and with David Bentley Hart, so I shy away from the debate a little bit. But I do think that some possibility of damnation, with some debates about what that means, is generally a requirement for Orthodox Catholic belief.
And how is this, how is this consistent with sort of people's common sense, moral intuitions, which we bring to criminal law, or we bring to kind of any other kind of topic we're thinking about? I mean, I think if you took people and you said, well, here's someone who's a rapist, here's someone who's a war criminal, maybe they would say, okay, they deserve to be executed, maybe they deserve to be locked up. I think that, you'd have to be I think if someone came and said we would hold them down and torture them, nonstop for 40 years, I think most people would think someone like that was deranged, didn't have like a proportional moral sense. But then we have a faith that says there's the perfect loving God who does that to some portion of humanity. How is that sort of consistent with our ideas of morality?
I mean, the way that the argument that's made, I mean, first there's sort of clearly like moral intuitions shift in different cultural contexts, right? And my moral intuition is similar to the one that you just expressed, right? That there is something sort of inherently excessive and unjust seeming about certain forms of eternal punishment. I think that marks me in some way as a certain kind of liberal modern, and I do think that especially someone who's a Christian who thinks that a 2,000-year-old faith is true, but even someone who's not and is just sort of aware of like cultural contingency and so on should have some degree of awareness that lots of people in other times and places have had somewhat different intuitions, right? So that's just one stipulation that I would throw out there. I mean, with that said, right, like rolling with your intuition, I think the sort of modern Christian response tends to be you shouldn't think of hell primarily as God sort of standing there with a whip and lashing the sinner for all eternity, although certainly images like that do appear in Christian writing. You should think of it rather as just a corollary of the one of the most fundamental Christian doctrines, which is the idea that human beings were created to have free will, to have their consciousness participates in and sort of partakes of the divine consciousness. That's what made in the image of God means, but it has some degree of separation, and that separation and distinctness allows us to refuse God, and allows us to refuse God not just in our own lifetime, but potentially forever. And if you refuse God forever, then that is what we call eternal torment. And you can't rule that possibility out without saying, in the end, human beings don't have real freedom, right? And that, and so if you read like, there are sort of attempts to dramatize this. If you read a book like C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, where, it's sort of a religious, not a parable, but, somebody has a kind of Dantean experience of going to the realm of the dead. And in this is sort of heterodox Christianity, but in this view, there are people for whom hell becomes purgatory if they sort of figure things out and ascend to God, and like angels come down and talk to them, or people come down and talk to them and try to talk them out of their own recalcitrance. But then there are people who are just like, I'm just who are just sort of remaining with themselves, choosing themselves over God forever. And what that, the other question is, what does eternity mean? Right? Which I'm not fully qualified to answer. When we talk about eternity, are we talking about an extension of time as we understand it, or are we talking about something different? I think that also plays into your one sense of the justice or non-justice. But yeah, I think there are good reasons why some Christians incline towards universalism. Some Christians incline towards annihilationism, which is the idea that the recalcitrant soul is ultimately is destroyed or ceases to exist, rather than persisting forever in godless torment. I don't think the critique of hell is unreasonable. I think it's a bad reason not to be religious, but I think it's an understandable argument within a religious context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I buy that idea that, okay, well, moral intuitions are one way and they're another way. I mean, if to the extent we can do that to just about anything, right? Our honor killings, right? Are they bad? Is sacking a village and raping all the women? Well, people have different moral intuitions, so who are we to say? I think that if we
It's
can't
it's
say
a
that.
little it's a little different with this only because the doctrine of hell, more so than the sacking a village and raping the women, coexists for a long period of time with intuitions that still form the basis of sort of modern liberal civilization, right? Like a lot of the sort of egalitarian impulses derived from the New Testament. The idea of human equality, treating the poor well, these kind of things
Hmm.
coexist in a powerful way. Like in the New Testament itself, Jesus seems to be talking about the idea that the corrupt people he's condemning, who the modern liberal would also condemn, are going to hell. Right? That would be my only hesitation. But yes,
Hmm.
I certainly agree with you that that's not at all like you can't just say, oh, people in the past believed this, therefore we should take it seriously.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very kind of. It's always been a kind of moral stumbling block with me for with all of this, especially with Christianity. But you're telling me that there's kind of debate within the faith regarding
Well,
what it actually means and
well, I mean,
eternity.
this is where I want to be transparent, right? Like there are people, Christians, who would strongly disagree with some of the approach that I take in this book, right?
Sure.
And like here, having this conversation with you right now, my inclination with you would be to say, oh, if you're interested in Christianity and you find the doctrine of hell an impossible stumbling block,
Hmm.
then the thing to do is to begin with or within one of those parts of Christianity, and it's mostly liberal Protestantism, which I think you might not be attracted to in other ways, just from reading your writing. But there are portions of Christianity that would their teachings on hell would not
Hmm.
pose this stumbling block to you. But another equally no doubt more intelligent Christian might say, no, Richard, absolutely not. Like, this is if this is your stumbling block, this is a core doctrine of the faith, and
Yeah.
we're not in the business of sort of creating special seeker sensitive havens for heretics.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, and you go even beyond that. I mean, you say even if it's not Christianity, right? Anything that gets you on the path. So yeah, I found that interesting. I didn't sort of. How do you think about this in the context of like you call yourself you're a conservative
Yep.
Catholic, right? Most people I think who would have considered themselves conservative Catholics throughout history probably would not have thought like this. I can't imagine like a middle-aged pope saying, whatever religion sort of speaks to you most, start with that. It's better than nothing. How do you think of this kind of like your kind of is it a compromise with liberalism or kind of like
I
like
would I would call it a response to pluralism rather than liberalism per se, right? I think, the medieval pope is dealing with a landscape in which, one, the church has not absolute cultural authority, it's contested by kings and princes and so on, but, really strong cultural authority. There aren't the only rival religious traditions in that environment are in medieval Europe are the Jews and potential heretics in rebellion against the church, right? And the church is a political entity with sort of direct political responsibility for sort of stewardship that includes the stewardship of the human soul. That's just a really different environment from the one that the Catholic within the United States finds themselves in today. Most people in the past faced a pretty stark either or choice. Are you accepting the sort of one core religious consensus of your society, or are you rebelling against it? And people like you and I have a not infinity, but incredible diversity of religious choices. And in that environment, whatever some of my post-liberal friends would say, or maybe they wouldn't even say this, right? Like the idea of religious uniformity in this dispensation seems really, really unrealistic. And from a perspective that, again, assumes that God is not out to get us all, right? You have to assume that God's providence works in this environment no less than in the Middle Ages. And the only way that I can see that God's providence would work in this environment is to provide some form of grace and help, um, even to people who, end up somewhere other than the Catholic Church. Now, with that said, as a conservative Catholic, I want the church itself to be true to its own doctrines, right? And that's how I can be, there is, I don't, there is, I don't think it's a tension, but there is some, potential tension here between how I want the bishops of the church to speak, how I want the Pope to speak, how I want the church to teach, and what I would say to you, the religious seeker. I don't want Catholicism to necessarily compromise or water down its core doctrines. If it is the church founded by Jesus Christ, then it really has a responsibility to take those doctrines seriously. But the person who is not about to become a Catholic is still, I think, can probably benefit from a spiritual venture that doesn't initially take them all the way to, full obedience to the Pope and so on.
Yeah. So it's kind of like the way I think of it is like, there's people on the left who say, the economy is not fair. Some people are born with rich parents; they're born with all the advantages. Some people are not, and that seems pretty unfair, right? And it
Yep.
seems like it seems like the path to salvation is more unfair than the most, the worst imagination of these people as far as the economic system goes, right? Because you have some people born in Christian communities, they might have all the best role models. Even people like me and you are privileged because we have, access to all of the world's information. So if more thought and more sincere seeking should get you closer to Christ, we have better chance than most other people. At the same time, you have people who are dying when they're 20, people who grow up in terrible circumstances and cultures that glorify things that you would call demonic and so forth.
Yes.
How do you think about kind of like just the fairness of the opportunities you and I get to find God compared to people who get nothing close to that?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that it's a little more complicated than that, just insofar as some of the opportunities that you're describing for you and I also coexist with particular kinds of temptations,
Yeah.
right? And there are situations where the person born into squalor and suffering, before you get to like questions of religious doctrine, right? That person may end up having a more profound and immediate relationship with God. And I say this just, in part based on my own experience with like my one bout of sustained suffering in my own life, right? I had chronic Lyme disease for a long period of time, still have it to some degree, but not anything like it was. That was a really bad time. And it was a time, but it was also a time where my my felt need for God was stronger than at any other point in my life. And I'm not offering this as like a reason why you should believe in God. Obviously, the skeptic will just say, "Oh, of course you have this psychological need for God and so on," right? But if you think God exists, right? If you stipulate that God exists, then the person going through certain kinds of privation and suffering oddly may be in a better place in terms of realizing the need for God and sort of the actual priority of things in the universe. Anyway, that's one point. But then conceding that there is a certain clear unfairness baked in, I do think you have to sort of assume that God's judgments and how God relates to human beings takes that to some degree into account, right? And so, the passage from the New Testament that I cite in the book, right, is, the parable that Jesus tells about these servants who are all given a certain amount of money when their master goes away. And one servant is given a lot of money, and another servant is given less, and another servant is also given less. And two of them invest the money, the one who has a lot of money and the one who has a moderate amount of money, and they both earn returns. And their returns are going to be different, right? Because they're starting out with different amounts of money. But when the master comes back in the story, he praises them equally, right? And his condemnation is then reserved for the servant who takes his money and is like, "Oh man, the master's out to get me. He's out to trick me and get mad at me. I'll just bury it in the ground." And the master really doesn't like that reaction. And I think that reading of God is at least one way to make sense of the unfairness you describe, right? That people are obviously given different situations in life and different starting points and different things that they can do and react to. but it does still matter from God's perspective what you do from that starting place. And that's, again, part of where I think the believing Christian can also say, well, someone who doesn't get all the way to religious truth might still be the equivalent of the servant who started with a little bit of money, invested it, got somewhere, and did something pleasing to God. But that unfairness is also like, there are like religion. One of the points I try to make in the book, right, is that it is in fact the case that the big religious systems have spent a long time arguing about just these issues, right, and thinking through them. And there are reasons that sort of different systems converge on different kinds of ideas, right? And so, there are people for whom the unfairness that you describe is a good reason to believe in something like reincarnation, right?
Mm.
Like reincarnation does seem, I think it has some other issues, but it does seem to solve for certain kinds of unfairness that the individual life presents. And I will certainly, as someone whose church doesn't believe in reincarnation, I will plead a certain ignorance and uncertainty to like the case study where you're like, okay, the 3-year-old who died barely experiencing life at all, what's going on there, right? What happened to them? Or even, there are people, and you notice this maybe more as you get older, right, who don't die early, right, who live a long life, have a lot of experiences, but also just don't seem to get anywhere,
Yeah.
and I would not, and I often think about that. Like, I feel like there are people where, I look at their lifespan and I'm like, is this person damned? It seems a lot to say that they're damned.
Yeah.
Have they accomplished something that, takes them to the beatific vision? I'm really not, maybe people would say that about me in the end, but I think those categories, I think you end up with reasonable questions about any sort of full systemization of the afterlife. There are going to be case studies where, you just have to say, I'm not sure what God is doing here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's got to be a lot of that. I think so in the religious worldview. I get that. When I think about that, the saving and the investing, I just think God must really hate those people who leave their money in checking or in, savings accounts and get that 1% interest. God wants you
Well,
in.
not in, but in high interest rate periods, those.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. There is a certain, what's interesting about the Bible is that there is both a sort of steady critique of riches, the accumulation of wealth, greed, and so on, and also a language. There is a financial language that
Yeah.
runs through both the Old and New Testament.
Yeah.
But I would also stipulate like that. Yes, the religious person, when it comes to the specifics of individual lives, especially lives that you yourself don't have full access to, the religious person does often have to say, yeah, I'm not sure what God is doing here. At the same time, I think the fact that all of the major religious traditions extant in the world today have converged on certain kinds of overlapping codes of ethics and certain kind of overlapping visions of a good life leading to different destinations, a bad life leading to other destinations. Like, Eastern and Western religion disagree about reincarnation versus eternal damnation, but the Eastern religions believe in hell and purgatory too. They just treat them as, they sort of take it for granted that at a certain point the soul moves on, right? But there is more convergence, I think, in how the enduring religions have approached, what it means to lead a good human life and be in right relationship with God than some secular people might assume, right? Like, it isn't really the case that you have 1.27 million different religions and each one teaches something completely different, right? And Aztec religion teaches something
Sure.
different, and there are some religions we're well rid of. But I think that I think you can still see enough general convergence, again, to say, like, God's not just tricking us by giving us an impossible choice between an infinite array of options.
Mhm. Yeah, I think about sort of your ideas on divine intervention in kind of human affairs, and so one of the things you say is, there's the maybe I'll get this wrong, but basically Christianity's survival of this over this time period is at least an indication that there is some kind of divine plan unfolding here. What is the extent of like divine intervention in human affairs in kind of your worldview? Like when the bullet whizzes past Trump's ear, yeah, I think you probably don't think God is like telling me to eat a turkey sandwich or eat a steak tonight. But you probably think God would not be indifferent as to whether the president gets assassinated. So maybe he's there. Like, how do you think about sort of like where divine intervention exists and where do we have a kind of universe that's kind of mechanistic?
Well, I think you'd say two slightly different things, right? Like the from the Christian perspective, you might say first that there is a unfolding, largely mechanistic universe that is nonetheless under the providence of God, right? That God is allowing human freedom, but retaining retaining authorial power
Mm,
over the story as a whole, right? And so in that sense, something like the broader phenomenon of Trump, not just the assassination, but Trump as like, something you've written, like Trump is like the weird Hegelian great man of history, right?
yeah,
Like
Trump is.
something like that is enfolded in divine providence. It doesn't mean that God wants you to fall on your knees and worship Trump. It doesn't mean that, God wants Trump to win in the end and reign as dictator for life or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it means that like certain things that happen in the world that sort of stand out and become enduring parts of reality are in some way part of God's plan. Maybe God's plan to chastise the
Mm,
decadent elites of Western Europe and the United States. Maybe God's plan to hasten the arrival of the demonic machine god AI, right? Like who knows, right? But there's something going on there. And so there you wouldn't say God is, sticking his finger in to stop the bullet. You would say the overall pattern of history
mm,
that God is in charge of included this really important figure surviving an assassination attempt with all that entails. That is slightly different from the belief that there are events in history that are themselves just sort of supernatural, right? Meaning moments when the mechanistic structure of the world is in fact tweaked for reasons that are sort of, you know, basically, I think from a Christian perspective, understood as signs and indicators to be helpful to people like you and I to be in the right relationship with God, right? So
mm,
the idea clearly there's no economy where good people just get miracles and bad people don't, right? Like
mm,
you can just look around the world and see that that's not true. Like most people who get terminal cancer die from cancer, whether they're good or bad, and so on. Um, but the Catholic assumption, as a religion that is into the miraculous, is that there is sort of a pattern um, of sort of flashing indicators spread across human affairs
mm,
that are there, you know, primarily to help us know the truth about reality. That's what the miracles are doing. Now, Jesus' resurrection is a particular case that does something more than that. But if the question is like, why, why does God, permit certain healings associated with certain saints, right? It's not that the saints are dealing out rewards to the righteous. It's that by showing God's power over the universe is connected to these saints, God is giving you basically reasons to be Catholic, reasons to seek out a relationship with him. With again obvious like questions you can raise about why aren't there many more of these, like why doesn't everyone get one in the course of their lifetime or something like that. I think more people, as you can tell from reading the book, I think more people get these indicators
mm,
than is sort of generally assumed. I
mm,
think not miracles per se, but religious experiences in some form are distributed a bit more widely than the secular framework assumes. But like, you know, I, as a religious person, I've had some weird things happen in my life, but I wouldn't say I've had something happen to me directly
mm,
that I would call miraculous. I've, but I have, I've observed a lot of strange things. I
Yeah.
think.
Well, the Michael Shermer one was pretty incredible. I meant to reach out to him because I talk to Michael Shermer sometimes, and this is a guy from Skeptical Inquirer, and he had a kind of what seems like a miracle. I mean, I think if that happened to me, I'd be pretty.
He
You
had
know,
a
I,
magic, right? He had
yeah,
a broken radio that was completely broken that turned on for just one that belonged to the uncle of his fiance or something like
right.
that, right? And it turned on and worked and played a love song just during their wedding reception,
Yeah,
and then never
exactly.
worked again, right? And he
Exactly.
and no, and it's a great. I think I'm actually supposed to debate Michael Shermer as part of like a larger free press sponsored debate in Austin, Texas. So I'm sure I'll get the opportunity to talk to him about it. But I think he deserves enormous credit. For those listeners who don't, probably most of your listeners know who Michael Shermer is, but he is like Mr. Professional Skeptic of all things supernatural, right?
Right.
And so he had this thing happen to him, and I think there are people who have his worldview who have things like that happen to them who just bury them, who are like, I
Mm,
don't want to think about that. It doesn't fit my paradigm. I'm just going to shrug it off. And he wrote about it. He's written about it repeatedly. He's tried to sort of come up with sort of like multiverse based, like
yeah,
tesseract based
yeah.
theories of how it's compatible with materialism. But yeah, I think it speaks to his intellectual seriousness that he's been willing to sort of be public about this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, if it, so I don't think I've ever had an experience like that. And I think if I did, I would be like, all right, God wants me to hear a nice sentimental song, but then like there's a civil war in the Congo going on, and I would just be like, why is he playing a song for me when like
Well, but
there's
this is,
the
I don't know,
best.
man. This is where, the in, not to go all C.S. Lewis again, right? But in Lewis's, in the Narnia books, right? Aslan is sort of the not sort of, Aslan is the Christ figure, um, and people are always asking him like about, to sort of explain what's going on with someone else, right? And it's like, no,
Hmm,
that's their story. This is your story, right?
okay.
Like, you're in your story, again, this hasn't happened to you, but let's say tomorrow, right? The Archangel Michael appears at the foot of your bed and, gives you a wink and says Ross was right, and then disappears. Hypothetically, let's say that happens, right? Now, I mean, you could say, "Oh man, well, why did I get this?" And the person suffering in the Congo got nothing. I guess if God exists, he stinks, right? He's lame. Okay, or you don't know what the person in the Congo got. You don't
Yeah,
know. You don't
right.
have access to their experience. First of all, the person in the Congo is much more likely to be religious to begin with than
Sure.
than you are, and might need a completely different kind of help from God than you.
Mm,
Anyway, this hasn't happened yet. Unfortunately, you haven't had this experience. But
mm.
if you do, I can come back on the podcast, and we can talk through its meaning and implications. I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Okay. Great. That's a kind of incentive to have
To
to have
have,
a.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
See, this is why I
well,
think.
I mean, the materialist, has to say basically that the reason people have these experiences is there is some subconscious biochemical incentive structure in your brain generating,
Mm,
visions of the Archangel Michael or your dead ancestors, and so on, right? So,
mm,
in a sense, just from a materialist perspective, I have made it more likely, probably, that you will
sure.
have such an experience. The great thing about the Shermer story is that it's not a vision, right? It is a literal, a literal, um, it's the radio is real, right? Like,
Mm.
that's obviously the best kind, of miracle, when there's a sort of physical correlate and not just something that you see or hear.
Yeah, I think it would. I think for me, I mean, it would be because if let's say we end this conversation and just tonight I have this feeling of serene peacefulness, something that I've never felt before, and it feels like God is speaking to me, right?
Sure.
There's no way for me to sort of distinguish that between a miraculous event coming from the Almighty. And I just really liked my conversation with Ross and think it would be sort of cool to believe in God. And therefore, I got that feeling, right? So how would you, like, in the absence of like the Archangel Michael coming winking at me, some kind of broken record player playing, something like that, how would a person distinguish between like kind of wishful thinking, this would be cool, versus divine intervention?
I mean, I think there are some levels where it's hard to distinguish, right? I think if you talk about different categories of religious experience, for instance, I think I call it in the book like generic religious experience. And generic doesn't mean to minimize it, but it is these sort of general feelings of mystical well-being that people get them completely unbidden, but they're more common, among meditating Buddhist monks and Catholic nuns and so on, right? And I think those kind of experiences are naturally easier for the materialist to say, well, general feeling of well-being is even mystical well-being, even this sense of like being connected to everything in the universe it's not getting me, it's getting me towards maybe curiosity, but it's not getting me toward belief, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's reasonable to say there's a kind of ladder and hierarchy of different kinds of spiritual and supernatural experiences. I think it's clear if you read about, without having had them yourself, if you read, William James' variety of religious experiences to take, sort of one of the original texts that tries to look at all these things, there are certain kinds of experiences that people have that are not, are sort of, they're they are not easily deniable.
Mhm.
Um, they clearly go beyond the generic feeling of well-being and sort of impel some kind of response. And they happen to people who, are not schizophrenic, are not having like, aren't like dissociating and so on, right? And again, they are not like distributed clearly to every single human being in society. And it's reasonable, when you come before the throne of the Almighty and he says, Richard, why did you waste your life arguing for Canadian euthanasia? And you say, Lord, Lord, where was the,
Yeah,
intense sunburst of the Holy Spirit in my heart, right? Like you can, I think that the Bible makes it clear that God doesn't mind a little, a little argument,
little back and
argue,
forth. Okay, it'll
argue
be
a little back and forth,
lovely.
see what he says, right? But I also think like, okay, everyone doesn't have those experiences, but enough people have them that the purely secular and materialist person needs some account of what they are, right? And I think our current accounts are insufficient, right? Like it's just not the case that most people having religious experiences are schizophrenic or epileptic or mentally ill in these ways. Some are, but there is a kind of, there's a kind of religious experience that happens to perfectly sane people that seems like a suspension of normal experience and an intervention from outside. And that's a fact about the world that is worth taking into account in thinking about your systems, especially since, to go back to where we started, right? Like it sort of participates in questions about consciousness itself, right? And I think often the materialist is in the position of simultaneously wanting to say, well, consciousness is not real. It's an illusion, it's not real in a material sense. It's some kind of stapled together illusion put together from different modules in your consciousness, right? But it also has all kinds of crazy power to, you know, like transform your physical systems, right? Like this would be the explanation of apparently miraculous healings. You would have to say, well, your consciousness expected the healing or desired the healing so much that it sent a flood of antibodies into your liver and suddenly you were healed. And like that might be the case, but then you're taking a pretty strong view of consciousness as an actor and an agent in the world that is, I think, a little hard to square with like Daniel Dennett's view of its, sort of reducibility to illusion.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I did want to get to this kind of these experiences and this kind of empirical understanding of these kind of empirical case for the supernatural. But before that, I want to just finish off the idea of like God playing a role in the history of the universe, the history of our planet, because I just find this kind of fascinating. So, like to take an example, like you say, Trump, like God might have some kind of role for Trump. It would be sort of, we wouldn't think that someone who is this important in our politics, just God didn't plan for that, or it's just, no different from any other person. But then you also said, like, it's not necessarily that God is sitting there, putting his finger and making sure the bullet goes past his head. But that kind of is required, isn't it? Like if God really wants him to punish the elites or whatever it happens to be, he does have to change some votes in Pennsylvania. He does have to make sure some assassin can't come, some lone wolf can't come along and screw up these plans, right? So
Well,
it does.
God, well, I mean, to the extent that God is responsible for the all of the initial material conditions of existence, right? Like all I'm saying is that yes, it might be that God has to intervene in a sort of direct miraculous way, but it could also be that God, as the supervening intellect in charge of everything, has sort of finely calibrated the physical system so that the puff of wind takes takes the bullet aside, right? Like those
Okay.
are I think there's a distinction between those two things. I think both things are features of our existence. There's both an overarching plan that is manifest in sort of the ordinary interactions of physical systems with our choices, and then there are specific specific interventions. I wouldn't take a position on what I mean, there had an angel appeared and placed itself right between Trump and the bullet, then you'd say, okay, well, this is miraculous. Or you could imagine some sort of more semi supernaturalist goings on. In the event, it was just the bullet just missed incredibly narrowly, right?
Yeah, it could be.
I would not call that a miracle. I
No.
would say it was under God's providence in some way.
So you can imagine God maybe putting something in Trump's brain. Think about illegal immigration at this one point. He was looking at that chart. He turns his head, and it's kind of exactly. So it's got to be. I think there's got to be something. There's got to be some intervention. Could be he fine-tuned sort of the Big Bang, so he knew that it would sort of blow by his ear.
Right.
God, I guess if he knows everything, could possibly know that. There's just got to be you. But the point is, I can't have the free will to go off and kill a major figure who has a role to play. Like there has to be
that's a really. I mean, it's an open question, right? Like what again, like there's a reason that religious people have been arguing about this for a long time, right? Like how do you square God as author of the story with God allowing you free will, right? And there are reasons that like you have obviously religious believers who say in the end you just have to deny free, you just don't really have free will, right? Like and there is something that I think is it seems to me true, but vulnerable to some critiques in saying that you can have a sort of providential power steering the story and also have a certain degree of freedom inside the story. But where how those two intersect is not necessarily decipherable in the moment, right?
Yeah. So I guess one way I sort of I naturally end up thinking about this, about God playing a kind of role in the unfolding of history, is that like it's kind of he's a sitcom writer, and there's A characters and there's B characters. And I don't know if this is sort of consistent with like the ultimate equality of all souls out there, but there is there is a kind of idea that like Ross Douthat, you're pretty important. You have a New York Times columnist and so forth. What you do matters a lot. People could be brought closer to God due to your writing, or they could be pushed further away or whatever. I mean, what you do is particularly significant. But there's a kind of like spectrum of like how much of a role we're playing, where like Trump and Putin are over here and like you're over here and somebody is over here. And I like the idea. Like I love TV shows and movies. I do reviews. I love the idea of there being a coherent story underneath all this. And at the same time, it sort of seems like if you're cast as a C character, it sort of sucks. doesn't it?
Well, so again, I'm a bad example because I'm not going to argue for my own importance in any kind of cosmic plan. Right. But I think two things, right? One, from a Catholic perspective, it is in fact clearly the case that everyone is equal, but God also has these kind of favorites, right? Like the Virgin Mary being the being the ultimate example. And I have listened to arguments from sophisticated Catholic priest theologians basically saying, yes, part of my assumption as a serious Catholic theologian is that there is some way in which God loves us all equally, but also a way in which, the Mother of God is above me, and that's okay, right? And it's a little,
But is the
that's
implication that a theologian, is more important than most other people out there because I'm a Catholic theologian?
but here's another distinction though, right? Like there's sort of different stories running. So there is some kind of macro story, which is the story of, again, from the Catholic perspective, God creating human beings, giving us free will, seeing us, sort of rebel and and sort of fall into sin, and then enfolding that rebellion into a larger and more glorious story of our ultimate redemption, right? That's the macro story. In
Right.
that story, clearly, yes, there's a hierarchy of importance with Mary and Jesus at the top, and then if you read the New Testament, even among the disciples, like the Gospel of John, the author keeps referring to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved, right?
Yeah.
And he's the one who's there at the crucifixion when all the others have fled, and he's the one who Jesus entrusts Mary to. And maybe he's just sort of puffing himself up, but if you're an Orthodox Christian, you do say, yeah, John is even more important than Nathaniel or Bartholomew and so on, right? So that's true. Then there's the story of the individual life, right, in which everyone is the protagonist, right? Like in the larger story, you might be a bit player, right? Like the guy who helps Jesus carry the cross. That's it. That's all we know about him. The whole story of salvation, he does one important thing for a painful hour on the way to Calvary, and that's it. He's out. But he has his own story, right? And in his own story, there's, his life is itself a
Yeah.
story. It's a fractal of a larger whole, and the whole drama of all of human salvation can play out in the individual soul. Now, again, I will concede that what this means for the infant who dies, at 6 months old, and the person who spends most of their life in a coma, and all of these kind of cases is hard. It's hard to know, right? It's easier to say this about someone who lives a simple life in a rural area and doesn't affect the world, but lives for 87 years and has a lot of things happen to them. It's harder to say for sure what's going on in cases of truncated and foreshortened lives. But I do think just saying, like, there's a larger drama in which people have walk-on parts, but also a personal drama in which your role is central, is one way of sort of not acknowledging the reality of a hierarchy of importance, but not consigning individual lives to irrelevance at all.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
and that speaks to our own experience, right? Like whether you're a important Nietzschean intellectual, prominent New York Times columnist, or anyone else, your own life does feel to
Yeah.
you, I think, like a primary form of reality, a story
Sure.
with events and happenings and opportunities and so on. I think that's how most people experience their lives, not
Yeah.
as sort of like, you don't experience your own life as a walk-on part, even if you have a walk-on part in some larger drama.
Sure. And maybe being a parent sort of can put that in perspective for people, because even if your kid is not going to turn out to be, a president or a business tycoon or something, that story matters, and that story matters a lot. And, you wouldn't.
Well,
You would.
right, and a lot of what Christianity and other religions, but are urging on people is to you want to put yourself in a position where your story connects to other people's story in some profound way, right? And parenthood is sort of the cheat code for doing that. It's like the lazy hack to
Yeah.
become a better Christian is to have children and be forced to live a life of service to them and be integrated into their own being and becoming. But then, the Christian perspective is like, the higher forms of this are to commit yourself to the service of people who you are not, you're not related to, right? And sort of widen the the ordo amoris, to use the phrase that J.D. Vance deployed to great debate recently.
Yeah. Why don't so I was just thinking, why don't it seems like if you're a Christian and you're trying to convince elites to be Christians, maybe this kind of appeal to vanity maybe can work because I like the idea of me being like very important, and maybe
Hmm.
I'm not important, but I
Yeah.
am sort of egotistical, and if you tell me there's that my writing is not just me making a living and influencing some people, but actually has some kind of cosmic significance. Um, that would, that's psychologically appealing. I don't know if it's intellectually appealing, but it's at least very psychologically appealing. And maybe if Christians went out to elites and said, "You're here for a reason. You're here to do something. It's not just all, it's to feel kind of superior to other people and gain status in this world. It's like you are actually part of a story, and you're on the, you're an A character, or you're a B character. You're one of the people that actually matters." I think that would appeal to people, but I don't hear Christians kind of making that case.
I mean, I think it is something that Christian elites tend to tell themselves.
Sure.
It's a little different when the elite is sort of de-Christianized. But if you think about, like, the way in which the American Protestant upper class in the late 19th century thought of itself, there
Yeah.
was definitely a view, that kind of view, right? That, like, Protestantism is the vanguard of progress in history, right? Like, Catholicism is sort of the archaic form of Christianity. Protestantism is the modern form of Christianity. We, the white, let's say white Protestant elite of late 19th century America are, sort of leading humanity into the God ordained better future. And you can see just in that little sketch I gave you of why a Christian might shy away from making that argument too explicitly, because
Yeah.
it inclines people um towards a sort of blend of religious belief with, potentially serious vices, right? Pride, arrogance, things that Christians are not supposed to do. I do agree with you, though, that in a society where people, like, I mean, some of our elites have kind of a residual version of that feeling, like progressives were at the vanguard of the arc of history bending towards justice and so on. I think these days our elites are sort of plagued by a deep existential anxiety and even despair about, like, the future and their
Mhm.
place in the cosmos and so on. And so in that way, maybe there is something, maybe it's worth risking the dangers of pride and arrogance to
Mhm.
say to elites, hey, you have been placed in this particularly important position at this particularly important juncture.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think about this with someone like Elon Musk, right? Like, I do actually I think Elon Musk has we all have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, right? But I think with Musk, you can really see that. Like, you can really
Yeah.
see the way in which Musk does things that are potentially really good for humanity and can do things that are potentially really bad for humanity by virtue of being,
Mhm.
the great industrial technological tycoon of our age. And so I do think, like, if Elon were watching this video, right, I don't think it's empty flattery to say there's a lot at stake in the
Yeah.
struggle for Elon's soul, right? I think that that's true. But if there is a lot at stake, to get back to questions of damnation, right? Like, there's a lot. There's a lot you can lose,
Yeah.
right? If you're an elite who has some role to play and plays it very, very badly.
Mm. But I think God has to kind of so it's like, you get some kind of grace if you were in a situation where you didn't have good experiences with Christianity or whatever. At the same time, like, there we come in this world with certain traits, right? With certain psychological traits. And, as many people are kind of on a spectrum as far as how sort of in touch with the divine or how open they are to spiritual experiences. So if Musk if Musk just does not have the psychological profile to humble himself and get on his knees and pray to God, which seems like he's probably not as psychologically disposed to do that as other people, should he perhaps get some grace, or does he get some grace for that? Just like somebody born in the wrong environment might.
Yes, but I don't want to concede too much to that perspective. I think that there is a I don't know. I've done, a bunch of these kind of interviews and conversations about the book, and one reaction that I will get from people who are non-believers is to say, I find parts of your argument interesting, Ross, but fundamentally I just don't have a religious nature.
Mm.
And, I think in my original exchange with Tyler Cowen, when he was explaining why he isn't religious, despite being interested in religion in various ways, he said something along those lines, right? That like, it's just not it's not in my character to have religious belief and so on. Or I did an event with uh, Jonathan Rauch recently, who's again written a book about Christianity's relationship to democracy. Very interesting book, and he refers to himself as sort of colorblind about religion, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know. Maybe you would say something similar, and Musk might say something similar, right? I I I don't want to accept that argument fully, right? I want to say that yes, there are forms of piety and religious practice that some people are characterologically just not going to get to, right? Never going to get there, right? Elon Musk, in the character that he is born into the world with, was always going to yield some version of the vaulting, ambitious, would be Ubermensch, right? That was always baked in. Um, but does that mean he is incapable of like getting on his knees and saying a prayer? I think pretty obviously it doesn't mean that, right? And I also say this as someone who I don't think of myself as like temperamentally deeply pious. I'm not good at praying. One reason I appreciate Catholicism is that it makes me go to church every week. So I have to, I'm in a place, I have to kneel, I say prayers and so on. I need some kind of structure to push me in that direction. And okay, let's say my genes have still made me more pious than Elon Musk. Nonetheless, I think there can be a basic, like, the basic statement of there might be a God, or there's a good chance there's a God, and I should think about the existence of God while I'm shitposting on Twitter. Musk is capable of doing that, right? Don't you
Yeah.
think? I mean, not going to be Francis of Assisi, okay, and God
Yeah.
is going to judge him on the basis of being Elon Musk. But is there a version of Tyler Cowen that could practice a religion? I think there is.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think kind of, is there a version of Tyler Cowen? I don't know about Tyler, but Musk, I think about Musk, and I saw him retweeting some anti-vax stuff the other day. I said, oh, I see the path for him becoming religious. He just has to be
Right.
polarized into it. He
Into
has
it.
to
Yep.
just hate the left and then become religious. So,
Well,
yeah.
he's already that. I mean, that's already happened in the sense that he'll say like friendly things about cultural Christianity,
Yeah.
right?
More than before.
Because or
Right.
he likes the guys at the Babylon Bee, right? Like that
Yeah.
was sort of the impetus for him buying Twitter. So yeah, and that's that's not the ideal. I mean, I'm very open minded. I think everyone has a different path to God. If you're negatively polarized into converting to Catholicism, you should convert to
Yeah.
Catholicism,
I think
right?
that's a common
Absolutely. But
occurrence. Yeah.
it's not the ideal path, right? The Candace Owens path is not the ideal one.
Yeah. And I've had people, I mean, it does seem, I've had people say this, like I was around all these woke people. I didn't like it. I was looking for something different and sort of, Christianity was there. Yeah. I think that's common. It's a kind of humans are,
Well,
multifaceted.
yeah, I mean, that's a little different if it's there. Like, you want to be positively attracted to something, right? So,
Mhm.
like, if your 10 best friends, right? If the 10 people you like most in the world are all practicing, they're all practicing Sikhs,
Mhm.
right? Like, that's not a terrible reason to be interested in Sikhism, right? Like, I think that's okay if if you leave one group of friends and join a new group of friends, and the new group of friends shares a religion, and you're attracted to the friends, and then you're attracted to their religion. That's good. That's different from being like, I gotta believe in God to own the libs,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, but I just think the libs is sort of such a huge factor in sort of how people are thinking these days.
Yes,
That's just
that
a good reason. A good reason. Life in general,
people,
not to get
the libs, owning them is it's a powerful feeling.
is that a demonic force just pushing you in a wrong direction when you feel that, when you feel like I just hate these people politically and I've got to do whatever the opposite of what they want?
Yes, that is the sense of. I mean, I think you write about this a lot in your, sometimes trolling, sometimes not critiques of the right. But yeah, there's pathologies on both sides, right? But the pathology of,
Yeah,
if the establishment says X, I must say Y, is a very powerful one, right? And
yeah,
it's not just about religion. It's like,
everything.
because of my experience with Lyme disease, I have some sympathy for, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s critique of the medical establishment. But RFK Jr.'s view is like, if there are 10 things that the medical establishment says, 9 of them are probably fake.
Yeah,
And my view is that no, but maybe 2 or 3 are fake, and you should be open to that, right? And I think you don't want to get to where RFK has gotten, even if you're open to the reality that the establishment can get things wrong and conspiracy theorists can turn out to be right sometimes, which they sometimes are.
yeah, sure. So the yeah, so I did I in the remaining time, I guess I'll get to the parts that I found least convincing, and that was kind of the empirical case for the supernatural here on this planet. I did listen to your recent conversation with Tyler, and he seemed skeptical about a lot of this stuff, and I think I share his skepticism. And I'm just reading the book. I mean, the one thought that came to me was, okay, like there's got to be a way to test these things. I mean, there's the Randy challenge. I haven't looked too deeply into it, but I did read the Wikipedia page today in preparation of this. And James Randi was a magician.
Yep.
You probably know, who offered $1 million for anyone who could prove through blind testing that they were, they had psychic powers or whatever, and basically never ended up having to give $1 million. If you believe in something just like the power of prayer, there's a straightforward double-blind control study that you can do. Why don't we just do that and find out if it actually works?
Well, I mean, I think that the expectation is, again, not so there are people who would say and argue that in fact you should be able to, right? And
Mm,
there has been in fact decades and decades of people trying to do double-blind controlled trial experiments on psychic phenomena and people who claim psychic powers and so on.
mm,
And there's a lot of, I waded into that material at one point and have sort of waded back out and don't want to say something definitive about it. I
mm,
think there is interesting stuff in there that goes beyond just like people faking things, but there are also all these sort of weird patterns where you will sort of have 2 people do an identical study, trying to like control for every variable in the same way, and the person who believes in psychic phenomena will get results that indicate psychic phenomena are real, and the person who doesn't won't. Right? And is that, you could say, well, that's an indicator that these things are connected to your pre-existing beliefs because they are connected to consciousness. Or you can say, well, everything we know about the replication crisis suggests that really small things that you don't even notice in experiment design can bias results and so on, right? But all I'm saying is there are people out there doing some of this kind of work, trying to sort of figure these things out. There are people, there's a woman named Molly Worthen, who's a professor at UNC, who wrote a piece for the Times about people who are trying to do this with like healing prayer and stuff in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a lot of Christian ministries that do, sort of constant like healing prayer of people who are really sick and claim results and so on. So I don't want to exclude the possibility that there might be some empirical test that could yield some sort of general evidence for some version of the supernatural. What I do think, though, that, as I said to you before, my reading of what we mean when we talk about the supernatural is something that is like just very unlikely to be successfully subjected to those kind of expectations, right? That like it's not necessarily that 120 people praying generically for healing yields 10% better medical results
Mm,
than people who aren't being prayed for. No, it's that
mm,
like in a 1 in 578 cases, God intervenes to create a sign for reasons we can't fully understand
mm,
that you're just not going to be able to replicate that, right? And like the same applies certainly to the wilder stuff. Like, you're really going to put a demon in a laboratory and get sort of consistent results and so on? That also seems unlikely to me. And with psychic phenomena, similarly, like you'll get these accounts of people who seem to manifest really strong psychic gifts, and they study them and they're getting great results, and then they seem to sort of burn out, right? And it just, and maybe that's okay, that's just random fluctuations, it's the law of large numbers, but maybe these things are, closer to artistic genius, right, that emerges under particular circumstances and disappears otherwise. And you're like, well, why can't we just put Michelangelo in a lab and get him to paint the Sistine Chapel every time? And it's like, well,
mm,
that's not how that aspect of human affairs works. But I do think in the end that it's not it's I have sympathy with like the doubting Thomas in the New Testament who wants to see Jesus's wounds. I think it's okay
mm,
for someone to say, I'd like to see something like this, right?
mm,
And I, I'm not there. There's a book I think I mentioned in the Tyler interview by Carlos Ayer, who's a professor at Yale,
mm,
called "They Flew."
mm,
It's about levitating saints
mm,
in the Reformation period,
mm,
and the point Ayer makes in the book, which is really a really interesting read, is that you had these really public miracles that happened in the 1600s where a bunch of not tons and tons, but a bunch of very specific monks and nuns and so on um, levitated, right? Like actual miracle, no
mm,
wires. This is not a
mm,
con. And lots of people saw this. People would travel to see this. The monks and nuns themselves. Sometimes they could do it on demand. Sometimes it like just happened to them. Some of them like treated it as this incredibly annoying thing that kept happening to them that they couldn't control, right? And Ayer's point is that those miracles pass, like, apart from the miraculous nature, they
mm.
pass all of the normal tests of historical evidence, right?
Yeah.
And they happened for a while, and then they sort of diminished, and there were a few cases later. The last one was in the early 20th century, but you just, you clearly don't have cases like that today, right? And I think it is one totally reasonable for you, a skeptic, to read a book like that and to say, how convenient that
Yeah.
these happened before the advent of reliable, iPhone video technology. That's
Sure.
that's that's fine, right? But like, I wouldn't. We've also only had reliable video
Yeah.
technology for a very short period in human life that has happened to coincide with a kind of peak of secularism and an absence of a lot of really intense forms of religious devotion that characterized human life
Not
for most
everywhere
of
in the
history.
world. Not everywhere in the world, though, right? There are communities that are very intensely religious,
Not
and
everyone in the world, that's true. But if I showed to you like an iPhone video of someone levitating in Congo or Tibet, I don't think you would be immediately persuaded by it, right? Like
well,
you
I
want
would
you
think
want
that,
it you want it to happen
yeah,
under Western developed world conditions with like the New York Times video. I mean, you want you want, yeah, you want
I
American
mean, even it
levitation,
can be. I
right?
mean, it can be a crowd. It could be a crowd in the middle of
Yeah.
some sub-Saharan African country, and a local reporter could be there, and everyone could agree they see. It doesn't have to be that kind of
Well,
laboratory.
there are. I mean, not to like. There are cases like that, and I think they are more common in like there are more accounts of levitation right now. If you're just like looking for accounts of levitation, you will find a bunch of them in India and Tibet.
With
And again,
videos.
I haven't. I mean, there's a couple videos, but I haven't seen a like 100% convincing video. But if you're just going
Mhm,
on like sort of testimony, you
mhm.
you do have some testimony from those regions. But again, I'm not trying to. I don't think I'm going to talk you out of this perspective. I would just say, hopefully you're going to be on this earth for a while longer, and I do
Yeah.
think we're headed into a weirder period in human history than we've been in lately, in the past, and I would just, if you are past a video of somebody levitating, I would just ask you to keep an open mind.
Well, now we're in the AI era, right? So you don't know what you're seeing on
Well,
a
that's what
video.
I said
So
to
is that,
Tyler,
are
right?
you
We've also, there was this
like,
really narrow window where you could trust, yeah.
and we had that 70-year window or whatever, and unfortunately we didn't. That would be convenient. I don't know if that would
Well,
be.
right, no, and something like, I mentioned in the book, but the biggest public miracle that Catholics can point to recently is the miracle of the sun, which is sort of the sun dancing in fulfillment of prophecy by these kids who saw the Virgin Mary. It happened at the very beginning of the century, and it did happen just before it happened. It happened at a point where you can read like New York Times accounts of it. It has it passes some like basic media tests. Clearly, something happened there, but we don't have like full tilt video of it.
So
And if it had
this was
happened, this
in
was in
Portugal.
Fatima, Portugal, and if it had happened, 50 years later, 40 years later, even someone would have showed up with a newsreel camera. And so, I think it's okay to say to God, it's time for another similar illumination.
Yeah, but the sun would have been visible outside of Portugal, right?
Well, I'm just going to recommend that you can go
Okay.
read the Wikipedia page has a certain kind of, all Wikipedia pages have a,
A bias.
27% rationalist materialist bias. So I would read a few things besides the Wikipedia page, but if you're interested, it rewards further reading.
Okay, I
It
will look
was
into
a widely witnessed event that was witnessed in beyond the immediate confines of the event and requires some kind of weird heavenly phenomena explanation if you are explaining it in materialist terms. That's basically the way to think about it. And it was
Okay.
sort of predicted by these kids who said, show up here, you'll see a miracle. They weren't like, meteorologists with a clear grasp. It wasn't like, did you read Tintin, the Tintin books? No. Well, you should. Anyway, there's a moment where Tintin escapes from Inca priests by successfly predicting an eclipse. Anyway, I'm just raising that because that wasn't what was happening here.
Okay. I'll look into this. I'll pick up. I'm serious. No, I will look into it.
I would definitely read a Hanania review of They Flew.
You know what? Okay, I may do that. I wanted to ask you about it, but we're running out of time. I wanted to ask you about the historical Jesus. I actually found this quite fascinating, and I want to read a few books of that. I want a few books on that topic and do that too. So maybe I'll get to that, and I'll get to They Flew. There's a lot of interesting sort of leads.
We can the historical Jesus is also very interesting, and also though again a case study in sort of like where you start. So if you start from the perspective that if the Gospels include any seeming errors or contradictions at all, they can't possibly be true accounts, then you get very quickly into not a dispositive, but at least a plausible case for skepticism. I think if you come to the Gospels fresh and you're trying to figure out, are these likely to be eyewitness testimony from people who were really there and really knew him and really had this weird experience, whatever it may be, I think they're quite compelling. And a lot of the things that get pointed to as tensions and issues and contradictions are what you would expect from a group of different people offering their version of events. But it does, the theological frame, like there's a Bart Ehrman who, if you get deep into the historical Jesus, he's like, one of the most prominent skeptics. He's someone who came out of a fundamentalist background, right? And you can see in his writing that it was like this shocking encounter with, this seeming contradiction, or Matthew says something that seems in tension with something in Luke and so on, that just like impelled him out of his childhood fundamentalism and into skepticism. That's a very common experience. I think if you start without a kind of fundamentalist frame and you're just like, what are these texts and what are they saying, you get to some pretty interesting conclusions. But anyway, it's a journey, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, the contradictions is not surprising from an ancient text. I mean, you read about history of any ancient figure, it's Alexander the Great. There's like 5 different ways of like this person died or that person died. So it's not uncommon. They
Yeah,
are
and there in the Jesus stories, the how he died is quite consistent.
that part is consistent.
We've
Yeah,
got that
exactly.
down. Yep.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed this, Ross. Do you want to make a final pitch? I mean, I have a
No,
pretty
no,
smart.
I think
More.
if it's part of God's plan for you to be drawn towards the practice of some religious faith, I've done my best. So
How about my audience? Is there some kind of, besides reading the book, is there any kind of closing statement? Sure, their
no, I
souls
mean
are on the line.
I'm on book tour. You should buy the book. It's very inexpensive on Amazon.com. But also, I think what I said before, I would say to the audience as well, that I think people should be open to weirdness in human affairs, because I think there's going to be more of it in the immediate future.
Seems likely. All right, Ross. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Richard.